Hello and welcome to the Course in the Chaos. My name is Blake, and I am joined tonight, as always, with Mr. Grayson Gilbert. We don't have Jack with us tonight. He's running around doing something. Who knows? But he bailed on us. So this is really a dangerous kind of podcast because we're breaking our format tonight, and we're talking politics. We are in the week of the election, and so you have two pre-mill Baptists gabbing in your ears, and Jack is not here to defend himself.
No outline.
Presbyterians, post-mill, anything. So you might just want to just turn off right now. I don't know. No, not really. Stick with us. I think there's going to be some good reminders and things like that. When we come into political seasons, things are always a little topsy-turvy, and so we just kind of want to hit you with some reminders from God's Word to encourage you and maybe even persuade you a little on your voting and things like that. We asked on the page yesterday if there was anything that anybody wanted us to specifically address, and it was like one of our lowest engaged posts, so we may just be talking into
I also
nothingness.
wonder if part of it is still that if you look at what happened in the 2020 election, where there were people being actively suppressed on social media, that's always now in the back of my mind still with all this kind of thing is how many times, especially around election cycles, do you find like that stuff happening?
Right.
And nobody knows about it because it's not going to be found out unless somebody blows the whistle, right? But
you're just one of those conspiracy theorists.
I hated the term before. I hated conspiracy theorist, and I hated conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
I've actually always been that guy who's more, this is a bunch of baloney.
Yeah.
And you guys are crazy. And then, again, 2020 happened, and Papa woke up a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm no longer sleeping here. I'm like, this is actually pretty reasonable to think that
wait a second.
Yeah. And
the theories are being proven.
Well, and oddly enough, the term conspiracy theory was actually coined by, I think, the CIA or someone like some agency or someone within
one of the
an agency.
3-letter agencies. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was meant in particular to dissuade people from, buying into the quote unquote conspiracy against the government.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, that's ironic.
Yeah.
That's like, basically, don't talk about this, guys, because
you don't want to,
you're going to get Clintoned.
Right. Exactly. We're already getting, for our FBI
This is why we
agent,
need Jack.
You're Jack, please bring us back. Yeah. No, so elections coming up. This is the year of our Lord 2024. We're recording this on the 29th of November. If we go missing, all is well in our lives.
October.
Right now. So
29th of October.
Yeah.
We've traveled from the future to tell you exactly how the election goes.
Yeah, we're going to tell you exactly how it all went down. Yeah, exactly. We're coming live to you from our bunkers.
Yeah.
So obviously we don't have to rehash all of the politics of the last 4 years, but in the United States, things have been really wild. Probably we could say more divided than ever, I would say. We've got Donald Trump running up against Kamala Harris, and things have just been insane. Assassination attempts,
Quite literally, you have a sitting president who is not treated as a sitting president with Biden, and how the whole Democratic Party launched Kamala into the seat was wild. I mean,
right. So, again, unprecedented, sorts of things taking place. Abundant name calling and non-Christian activities and all kinds of things, the things that you typically find in politics. So this kind of leaves us asking, and we've seen online and heard other people talking about, well, where does this leave the Christian in this entire scene? Particularly as it seems that Donald Trump has gone, who was the conservative favorite, the conservative Christian favorite, maybe unlikable, but still better than the alternative. It seems as though in some of the recent statements he's made that he's gone soft on abortion and things like that, while J.D. Vance and others seem to be still kind of holding that line. And so that's made a lot of Christians, at least that we've seen online, say, well, we're just not going to vote. Like, that's a line that we're not going to cross, and things like that. So we'd just like to cover kind of scattergun kind of area. We don't even really have an outline, kind of showing my cards. We're just kind of going to be just gabbing back and forth again on our personal thoughts. And again, take it at that. You may disagree with some of the conclusions that we draw. And frankly, Grace and I may disagree on some things. I don't know. We haven't fully fleshed all of this out. But anyway, I guess point number one would be we live in a country where we have a truly a privilege to make our voices heard. In theory, I'll put an asterisk by it. Depending on the state that you live in, and depending on the things that happen behind closed doors and with the ballots and all that stuff, we won't get into all of those. Those conspiracy theories.
There's the human condition we call sin that creeps into every institution, no matter what.
Yes, in every aspect of things. But we do have a rare privilege to be able to come together in this republic and make our voices heard and things like that. So it is a privilege for both the Christian and the non-Christian to be able to participate in our government and cast votes and do those sorts of things. As we were talking about this just lightly before this episode started, we kind of put together some talking points and lists and things like that. And one of the big things that came up at first was the importance of not being overwhelmed by the macro situation of your world that you live in. We kind of have this place where we live with the news media and the internet and things like that, that it's a faux omniscience where we know things and we hear about things that we wouldn't normally hear about and really have no business knowing and don't do us any actual good in our understanding of things. And so we get flooded all the time with the 24-hour news cycle and all these different things in ways that the people that have come before us have not experienced that. And it can be very overwhelming. It can be very difficult to process what is true, what's not true, what's being spun, where's the points of persuasion, and all of these different things.
Well, and it's instantaneous too. I mean, that's You think about it. Even during World War II, people didn't know we were at war at first until they saw a newspaper.
Right.
I mean,
right. Or you hear those stories of when the war is over and there's still battles taking place days and weeks afterwards, historically, because the word hadn't gotten there that, oh, hey, we're done fighting now,
Yep. But it is an interesting phenomenon, I think, in that respect, where that faux omniscience really is a huge point. I mean, we've talked about that a bit in the past, but there's a weight that people can start to feel or sense that they must feel, if that makes sense. Right? Some people get overwhelmed by it. Some people are underwhelmed and they look at it and think, well, maybe I'm just cold and callous.
Yeah, right.
And I ought to feel something. Right. I actually think the truth is somewhere in the middle there. But there's a reality in which there's not only that faux omniscience, but that faux omnipotence. There's only so much we can actually do.
Right.
Within the spheres that we have that we can control. Right. Especially if you're not going to get into anything in the upper levels of the government, your options are fairly limited on what you can actually do within the scope of the law and everything else like that. So part of it is just being able to take a step back and recognize the aspect of God's sovereignty over all things, and especially in the midst of a time where it seems like things are getting worse and worse, or at least on the surface level, they look like the nation won't get any more divided. But I mean, how many times have you heard that? And yet, surprisingly, they can still get more and more divided.
Right. Right.
Either way, the point, though, in that is simple. There are certain things within our realm of responsibility we can control. And arguably one of those things is what we're talking about today. And that's where you can exercise your right to vote.
Right. Right. And one of the areas, too, when we're talking about things that you can actually control, is when you look at the world scene and then the scene nationally, you're like, this is this is just insurmountable. It's huge and unchangeable and all those things. But we know as Christians, one, that's not true, because God, being sovereign over all things, the nations are as a drop in the bucket to him. He raises kings, he tears kings down. I mean, we know all of these biblical facts. They just need to work, their way from our heads to our hearts. We also know that the solution to all of our country's problems are not going to be wrapped up in this election.
No.
It's not going to be that the rise or the fall of the United States ultimately is going to land on this one specific election. And some people like to pretend that it is. And I do believe that it is an important election, as every election is. But think of the decades of things that have led up to where we are at right now.
Yeah.
And it is the Christian's responsibility. If we're going to see change, number one, we need to be praying. It is a sad reminder that we have to tell Christians, you need to be praying not only for the candidate that you like, but we are to be praying for the candidates that we do not like, even if it is God changed the heart of the king. Turn the heart of the leaders, that they might repent and turn to you and do the things that they ought do and wield the sword rather, rightly, and those sorts of things. The areas that we've covered on this podcast before.
Yeah.
And we can't stress enough just the difference that individual piety makes. If you want to make a big difference, commit yourself to your family, commit yourself to your local church, be involved in your neighborhood, be involved in your city, your county. I mean, things grow up from there. If you're just overwhelmed by what's happening on the national scene, draw it back and say, well, what areas has God given me control over? And let me serve him to the best of my ability, by his grace in those areas. So raise your kids in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Love your spouse. Commit yourself to your local body. Work hard when you're at work. Love your grandkids. I mean, just on and on and on. And ultimately, those are going to be the things that make the largest impact, especially if the Lord tarries and we're looking down the road and we're talking, well, what's the U.S. going to look like in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years? The difference is going to be made by Christians who are living out what they profess.
Yeah. You look at the example of the early church, and this is just me thinking about Rome, right? So what happens, obviously, after Christ's life, death, and resurrection, but that you start to see Christians go out everywhere. And at first there's heavy persecution, and it ebbs and flows over time. But they're not living in a republic where they get to necessarily freely do the things that we do today. And yet these annoying Christians are going everywhere, bringing the gospel with them and being faithful stewards in their lives with unbelievers. So not only sharing the gospel, but they're reflecting the ethical values that God has, the moral system, part and parcel of what we've been talking about within the 10 Commandments series. But they're bringing this with them. And with that is this gradual Christianization of the nations. Anywhere that the gospel goes forth and is not stamped out entirely by persecutors or anything like that, you see that gradual change happen, and you see the betterment of that society happen. This is where Jack would be like, see, that post
Right.
But my point with it is that the largest effect that can ever be had will always be through the faithful witness of Christians you've never even known the name of.
Right.
Rather than one individual working with another team of individuals who will go down in history perhaps as great rulers, and I don't mean that as rah-rah great, I mean that as powerful. But at the end of the day, they're just a footnote in history. And ultimately, they're a footnote in redemptive history, which we know will culminate in the coming of Christ.
Right.
So all these different things, as long as you're looking at it within a proper perspective, you can say, okay, here's where I can maybe take a step back. And perhaps I don't need to get involved and be a politician, but I can be a blessing to my neighbor, or I can be a blessing to my local community. I think most people think on the grand scale rather than the small scale. And part of that might be that faux omniscience aspect of things again, where the world's been made kind of flat through the advent of the internet and everything like that. But we've lost that human to human or peer-to-peer connection where you just simply go and talk with your neighbors over the fence for 20, 30 minutes.
Right.
You invite people to the cookout that you maybe normally wouldn't ever get together with outside of that event. But you can actually make a meaningful difference for the kingdom in those ways.
Right.
Well beyond your years. And especially if you raise godly children and they continue to raise godly children and the Lord tarries, all you do is see that perpetuation of that effect where ultimately the Christian witness will be seen and felt and heard.
Right. Beyond a vote, which is ultimately what we're trying to accomplish, right? Like we want to see change enacted when we vote, which is why we vote in the first place. But we're talking about playing, that's really the short game. We're talking about playing the long game.
Yes.
In Christian living and things like that. One of the things you said, Grayson, about the early church going out and how they bring with them into these communities their, values, essentially godliness. What has God said is appropriate? What has God said is inappropriate? And things like that. One of the big struggles that people have in this election, particularly Christians, is where do you draw the line when you look at your party and you say, so if you're looking at red or blue, whatever, and you look at it and you say, there are so many things that I disagree with, not just the character of the individual and the personality of the individual. No one's making the argument that Kamala Harris or that Donald Trump would be a fantastic spiritual leader. No one's making that argument at all. And so the question is, okay, well, when they're holding to policies that, or are at least weak in policies that are not godly. I mean, so again, abortion being a big one.
Yep.
If both parties are saying, well, we're just abortions, not fully maybe supporting abortion, but just kind of drawing back from an abolition kind of aspect, how is a Christian then to navigate that situation, particularly with the abortion thing?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's a question I think that people need to think through a lot more today, especially because we're watching those values erode from the Republican Party. I mean, that's just a reality of it. And you're seeing the same thing with what I would say is just sexual anarchy, right? And it's no longer the party of your mom and dad or your grandpa and grandma. That much is very, very clear. Some people are okay with that. I think if you're going to be conscionable and look at these issues and say, okay, if I've been a one issue voter for my entire life and you're going to be consistent with that, I mean, yeah, you're going to have to perhaps find a different way to vote this time.
Right.
What it comes down to, and I think it ultimately, this is where you can get into the weeds with ethical systems.
Right.
What type of Christian ethics do you embrace? For some, they can be overly pragmatic. And what I mean by that is they are purely concerned with the outcome, so the ends justify the means. Everything that happens in between, so long as the outcome is good, you might not like, you might raise your nose at, but you're not going to necessarily bat an eye. For others, they would look at it and say, there's an aspect of pragmatism in it, right? I have to look at perhaps what is the greatest possible good that I can accomplish this way, as opposed to what will happen if I go a different way, if that makes sense, or if I don't vote at all. And so there's very realistic things within that come to play. Blake, I think you had made a mention of it, but very, very likely the next president will choose 2 members of the Supreme Court.
Right.
But you also have different things that are, you look at what the Democratic Party stands for, and I mean, there's no pretense there. I think eventually you're going to see them just say, yeah, you can terminate the life of your infant after they're born.
Right.
They've pushed that goal, I mean, from day one. And so you can look at it and say, even within the scope of that, I am an abolitionist, but this is the greatest possible good I can do because pro-life is better than no-life policy.
If you don't think that's, I mean, and if you don't think that's the case, I mean, the most advanced societies historically, toward the end of their demise, infanticide becomes, a key feature.
Yep.
Of just saying, well, just if you don't want the child, just kill the child, leave them out to the cold, just be done with them. And if we're just animals and we're not made in the image of God, and we're just, thinking bags of meat, then ultimately life has no purpose, no matter, and all this. And so it's easy to like draw those conclusions and to be able to consistently walk in your worldview and say, it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. What matters the most is the maximum pleasure that I can experience right now.
Yeah.
And that seems to be one of the driving forces behind the Democratic Party's agenda. It's what can I do for me right now?
Yeah.
And so we have things like, again, sexual anarchy, abortion. I mean, being one of the primary driving things in this whole.
Well, and euthanasia has been floated around for ages too from the Democratic Party. They've not quite gone full bore into that one as much, but you can see, there's what was punishable by law, or technically what still is, obviously, in our country today. Many would love to do away with it. And so now you're talking about not just the preborn or the infant, but the elderly. The weakest members of society that our society could look at effectively and say, we just don't particularly want you around because
you are not contributing and you are a drain on society. You want to balance the budget, then take out the old people.
I mean, it's utilitarian at that point.
Right. Yeah. And so you start getting some of those arguments. Now that's not, of course, what the current platform is, but you do look down the road and you say, well, where do these things progress to? Which is some of the arguments that Christians make. Yep. Some of the Christians are saying, I will not vote for Trump because he has gone weak on, apparently, seemingly. The guy says, one day he'll say one thing, and then the next day he says something that seems just the opposite. So he's kind of hard to track that way. For not being a politician, he's very
he's definitely
political speak. Yeah, got a lot of
slippery eel. That one,
got a lot of political talk going on. But the argument is this: if he goes weak on this, then that means if he gets elected, then abortion essentially will no longer be an issue for the party. It will no longer even have to be that dangling carrot that keeps Christians coming back, because a man has won the Republican side without even having to say, well, no, we don't want abortion and things like that. And so is that a legitimate fear that we're just sliding into Hades in our political system when it comes to that? Yes, I think that is a legitimate fear. Now, the conclusion that you draw off of that is going to depend. I mean, it's going to be highly individualistic. Again, I know people that are saying, we're not voting for anybody. Like, we'll just write in King Jesus or something because we can't cross that line. I think, if I can show my hand anyway, for me, one of the things I mentioned to Grayson and Jack offline was, again, very likely, the next candidate will be picking 2 Supreme Court justices. We have 2 on there right now that are just about at the expiration date. And that will impact decisions that are made in the Supreme Court for literally generations. And so that's a big deal to me. It's also a big deal that I've heard it put this way: it's better to have Saul than Ahab. That you may not you may not like everything about Trump, but do we have to honestly admit that he's better at least from some sort of Christian perspective, than Harris.
I don't think that should be difficult.
You're right. Even if we're just counting,
and
even
I
if
really
we're just
don't like them at all.
up, right? Even if we're just tallying up secondary things, we have to say, okay, it's better to have Saul, who loses focus and is chasing David around trying to kill him, and it's better to have this guy than it is to have Ahab. And we may not like either, but it is truly, I believe, one of those cases of the lesser of the evils. Now, I know Charles Spurgeon said, when it comes to choosing the lesser of two evils, choose neither.
Yeah.
And that may be the answer. That may be the answer for some folks.
Well, I classically always say, I don't believe in no-win scenarios, right? Yeah. It's the Kobayashi Maru.
Right.
It's like...
yes.
Yes. But when you're looking at things like this, it becomes more complicated, and that's the whole point, I guess, I would make with it. And
you also have to consider that one party as a whole actively hates your worldview.
Yeah.
I mean, actively hates what you stand for, your God, your moral principles. And though the Republican Party may not reflect your moral principles the way that you would like them to, I wouldn't say that in almost every case they actively hate your moral principles. I mean, if we were to even bounce this, off of the 10 Commandments, I mean, if we were to take them one at a time and say, well, who would be more in line as a party, as a whole, for these, different aspects, we would have to say that, again, not perfect. And I'm certainly not saying it's God's party, but we have to say that one side at least does not actively hate every aspect of who you are as a Christian. So to me, and this is just me talking again, this does not necessarily reflect the views of Grayson, Jack, or the Chorus in the Chaos podcast.
It just reflects 1/3 of them.
Yeah, just 1/3. Yeah. Right. No. Right. The Chaos and the Chorus, the Chorus and the Chorus in the Chaos is like it's like an egg. There's the shell and there's the Trinity, Trinity illustrations.
Oh, I thought you were doing a Shrek thing. It was like, the ogres are like onions.
Like an onion. Yeah, right. No, like a clover. Grayson is one leaf, Blake's another, Jack's another, and we make one chaos in your chorus.
All right. Enough with the bad analogies there, Patrick. Come on, Patrick.
Jack, we need
thing I would look at though with all this is, I mean, Jack and I, before Blake was even part of this, we've been speaking on politics for years. I mean, you can find a number of blog posts that we've written on this kind of thing, stuff we've put on the page, and we would all three agree, no matter what, there's not an option to be silent.
Right.
There's that aspect of, if you're going to avoid the difficult conversations, you don't talk about religion or politics. It's like, well, we talk about religion all the time, and therefore we're going to talk about politics as well, because Christ is Lord is a very political statement. It's not apolitical. Christ ruling the nations with a rod of iron and smashing them to pieces is not apolitical. At the end of the day, when we're looking at this, yes, there are some different ethical questions you're going to have to balance out as a Christian. You have to go in your own conscience according to the Word of God in order to make that decision well, because again, as Paul would say, without or if you violate your conscience, it's sin. So be mindful of that principle too. But this is not an area we just get to abdicate from. And so you can not vote. I mean, that is an option. As you know, people that are doing that, Blake, or writing in a name. I know people that do that. That is an option. That's still exercising your constitutional right there. The question I would simply ask in the midst of that, though, is, are you doing it on the basic are not basic, on the basis of biblical principles, and saying, within this framework, I have to align with these certain values. And by God and conscience, I can not do another thing. I know plenty of people that are, loosely acquainted friends from high school and stuff like that would claim to be Christian, and yet are going to vote for the Democratic Party because they believe that that's the best thing that they can do. You've had guys like David French advocate that. You've had Russell Moore hint at stuff like that. Plenty of these other bigger names within evangelicalism. I think that's utterly wicked, because what they're immediately doing is rejecting wholesale what God has not only called important in his word, but a non-negotiable. And so you have to be able to look at that. Now, within others, though, they'll take the abdication approach and say, I'm just going to bow out entirely. That's where I would even say to you, instead of bowing, let me back up, because this is probably where I might lose some. People think the most important elections are the presidential elections in our scheme of things as a government. I would actually argue it's the opposite case, and that the most important elections you make are your local elections. And the reason for that is because you are now choosing the people who are going to make up the electoral vote and stuff like that as you're working through all sorts of different things. But also, I mean, look at your own municipality and who you choose as sheriff or mayor or school board elections and all that kind of stuff. Everybody wants to complain about the schools, and rightfully so, because they're garbage. But how many years did people not even bother to vote for school board?
Right. Or investigate,
or go to the meetings.
The individual that's going to be running for the school board and things like that. And
you
focus so much on the big macros that you miss, again, somebody coming into your local area that, again, is actively working contrary to who you are.
Yep. But let's pretend for a moment that that's not the case. Those are not the important elections. The big one is the important one. And it is important. I'm not trying to minimize it. So don't think that I'm saying that either. What I am saying, though, is that no matter what you come down to in the end, you're going to have to make decisions based on the priority of the Word of God. And second, general principles of wisdom. And I would say third, according to the conscience. And in light of that, go and vote freely, go and not vote freely, but you can't arguably say I can, in good, clean conscience before the Lord, cast a vote for somebody who wants to kill babies or wants to open up the floodgates of all sexual anarchy, even with our children, or wants to do things like euthanasia or everything else under the sun that Blake just said they are actively working against your moral precepts and values. So I will say you can't do that. If you're going to be one who honors the Lord, you simply can't do that. You can't vote Democrat. It's not old school liberals anymore. And it's been away from that for a very long time. I mean, talk about the Republican Party changing. Look at the Democratic Party as well. Now it's basically full-blown socialism. That's kind of being pumped behind the scenes. And policy-wise, you can see that with people even like Harris.
One of the things we need to remember too is that what is produced in our leaders is usually a product of the hearts of the people.
Yeah,
and it goes back to our first point of, if you want to see better candidates, I truly believe that better candidates will be put forward if the hearts of the people change. And so if people are coming to know Christ and families are being changed and the cultural and religious pendulum of America swings to where it needs to be, then then it makes sense that we would have like a full-blown Christian, take up the head of a party at some point. It's not beyond the realm of possibility for those things to happen. And that's just not the case in this election. So you're going to have to You're going to have to make some decisions. And I'm with Grayson. I don't know how a Christian, I can see how a Christian could vote Republican at this point. I do not see how a Christian could vote Democrat at this point. And I can see how a Christian would just choose not to vote. So, it's kind of all over the board there. So anyway, what else do we got, Grayson? I'm going to be glad when this is over.
I know.
You say that. I guess I say that. I say, like, I'm going to be so glad when the election's over and things calm down. But they're not going to calm down.
No.
Like, no matter what happens. In fact, I've seen a whole poll online earlier today of, like, what do you think's going to happen if Trump wins? What do you think will happen if Harris wins? And it was just by vote of, like, to what level of anarchy are things going to slide into, with all the various things.
It's really actually going to be quite interesting to see. My skeptical side.
Yeah. Obviously what we want is the most peaceful outcome.
Yeah.
Not really interested in Civil War or World War III or any of those things.
No, it would be great to not have that.
Right.
The thing, though, we have to, I think, come back to in that sense, though, too, is recognizing, again, this is that aspect of the sovereignty of God that many don't like as well, where we've posted the quote a number of times from Calvin, talking about when God wants to judge a nation, he gives them wicked rulers, right? And, I mean, that's been kind of like the bread and butter for so many for the past decade. Think about it. But it was part of what I talked about with our church this last Sunday, where I brought them back through Romans 1, right? I brought them initially to Daniel 4 and talked about Nebuchadnezzar and his whole point with Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel is called in to interpret the dream because all the soothsayers could not interpret the dream. Right. Daniel basically just tells him, you're going to be made into a goat for 7 years, and you're going to eat grass. And the way my imagination works, I get a vivid picture of just this man as he's continuing to. He looks like Tim from Monty Python's Holy Grail. But all his advisors are just walking by and seeing this once great and mighty king that ruled the known world, brought low in humility and eating the grass. And he's certainly not going and using the palace bathroom, He's just a mess. And then one day, as his eyes are no longer dim, he looks to the heavens and he praises the Lord because he recognizes that God is the true king. And the whole purpose behind it that Daniel tells him in chapter 4 is that you may know that it is heaven that reigns.
Right.
We might be seeing that in our day today with America, that God quite literally has handed over the nation to judgment. And we can see that in various ways simply because we know Romans 1 talks about this reality. All the vices, the lists of sin that are produced are from a rejection of God, meaning that they did not honor him as creator nor give him thanks, so they reject God. And then everything that we see as far as gossips, slanderers, liars, thieves, drunkards, swindlers, homosexuality, all that kind of stuff that he includes within that list is all just the fruit of their rejection of God. You look at our nation wholesale, and that's what they do. And as a result of that, perhaps, we are seeing a humbling. And I don't mean necessarily even just the church. I mean the nation as a whole. Each individual might get a slice of humble pie as things progressively go from bad to worse. And we don't know what that looks like. We don't know if it will happen. May the Lord be pleased to spare and to relent.
It does seem to be, though. I mean, you look at Israel in the Bible, and idol worshipers are in control. Things get really bad. What do the people do? They cry out to God. And they get right, and they do what they're supposed to do. And then it's kind of that easy times make soft men, and soft men make hard times, kind of thing. And you see this constant up and down, following the Lord, not following the Lord, following the Lord, not following. I think, again, and this is in the mind of God because we don't know what's going to happen. I'm praying that we are just in a place right now where as a nation, we're being shown our absurdity, and that it will not ultimately lead in our destruction, but that it will lead to a crying out to the Lord and setting back to, no, God is first, and Christ is king, and all of these different things that are going to affect actual, change in the nation.
Yeah.
Did you see, you mentioned that Calvin quote. Did you see the Wes Meemster post today? It's Calvin saying, when God wants to judge a nation, he gives them wicked rulers. And then there's a picture of like a painting of like Isaiah with like the flashing eyes. And it says, when God wants to punish a nation, he gives them women rulers.
I mean, it's literally what Isaiah says.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I know. It's like, oh, man. People are always quoting Calvin, but they're not quoting Isaiah.
Yeah, Isaiah was a boss.
Yeah, right.
Just brought it.
No holding no punches. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, another reason you can't vote Democrat, Isaiah.
Yeah, Isaiah.
Yeah. So, anyway.
If we're going to be biblical, we got to be all the way biblical. I mean, people want to get biblical until they read it, right?
Yeah. Everybody wants to be biblical until Isaiah.
Yeah,
right. So, I don't know. Any other things in closing, Grayson?
Just be reminded again, God is king, and that's ultimately going to be the thing that, regardless of how it shakes out, whether everything works out wonderfully and there's no riots, the king repents as Nebuchadnezzar did and honors the Lord from his office, whoever that might be. If that happens, wonderful. If it doesn't happen, and
how
America
wild would that be? Like, how wild would
can you
it
imagine
be if either one won? And then, I mean, legitimately, not for like political reasons, but even to their detriment, that like one of them comes to know Christ savingly and then just goes like full
bore.
Like, can you imagine like a full Christian Kamala Harris? Like,
that'd be wild.
What would that even look like? Or Donald Trump too. Like, what would that even look like? Now that's would be some political upheaval I could get behind. Yeah.
Right? Go down and cut down the sacred tree.
Yeah.
And then that's basically what would happen, I think.
Right.
I remember I had a friend from high school. After I was going through seminary, he's just like, you should be a president. And he was flaming liberal. In all intents and purposes of what that means. But I was like, you would not like me as a president.
Right. Yeah.
Because
right.
I would, my ultimate goal would be, to be for the people, but in the way that God desires, and here's how that would actually look. And
you'd like have that like Galadriel morph from the movies, and you would have a king,
and he shall be great and terrifying.
He's like, yeah, you're right. I wouldn't like you as president.
Yeah, that's true. Please take the ring off.
All would love me and despair. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it would be wild to see that happen. I would love for that, but it might go the opposite way too.
Right.
Either way, it's not as if this is a shock to God. Whomever he desires to rule, so to speak, will rule.
Right.
And they will be held accountable by the ultimate judge of all the earth at the end of their days for how well they ruled.
Yeah.
Specifically, did they fear the Lord and kiss the Son or pay homage to the Son, as Psalm 2 says?
Yep. Did they wield the sword rightly? Did they do everything within their realm of responsibility? And ultimately, God's purposes are accomplished.
Yeah.
So we have to be like people that don't have a robust view of God's sovereignty. I don't know how they make it through stuff like this. Like if your view of God is that he's in heaven wringing his hands, hoping that things will all work out. I don't know how you even get out of bed in the morning.
I know.
So
yeah. I mean, think of all the different things that happen on a daily basis, let alone major things.
Right.
I mean, quite literally the rise and fall of kingdoms. again, go back to Rome. When Rome fell, you have Augustine who sees it, right? And he writes on this reality. But the basic premise is that there's ultimately two kingdoms. Now, there's been a whole different theology born out of it that I'm not speaking to, but really there's the earthly kingdom, and then there's the heavenly kingdom. And ultimately, the earthly kingdom is part of God's jurisdiction, and he's in full control of everything. To think if the nation were to fall, as horrible as that would be, and America becomes a footnote in history, to think, though, you still have your heavenly king who cares for you more than the sparrows of the air and the lilies of the field. And even in the midst of his grand orchestration of all things ebbing and flowing through history, they're working towards your glorification and redemption, ultimately. That Christ will be the one who is seen as the rightful and true king, that every tongue confess and every knee shall bow. So you might have a lot of lost hope in politics. I mean, I'm pretty jaded when it comes to the political system.
Right.
But
no, I feel real good about it, Grayson.
Yeah, everything's real good. It's fantastic.
I feel like it's fair and that it always happens the way it's supposed to. Yeah. That's what makes it really hard. Like, I think, and we were kind of half jovially talking about 2020 earlier and things like that. There's a lot of people like our age range, a little younger, a little older, 10 years plus, 10 years minus, that have just permanently been affected by everything that has happened in the last few years that has really killed a lot of trust in systems and governments and things like that. So maybe some idols and things like that have been smashed, and we're left saying, well, God's in control, and hopefully the vote counting machines don't glitch on us,
Yeah, it'll be the Kamala curve. That's like a new dance move, the Kamala curve.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see.
Man, I do not want to see that again.
Can you imagine if that happened again?
Right. This is weird. This is
that's not right.
I still I permanently have that image engraved in my mind of that steep 90-degree leap of votes. Like, it's just anyway. Well, anywho, so vote, Lord bless you. This has been the Chorus and the Chaos, and we will see you after the riots.
Summer of Love.